What happens when love crosses continents but culture refuses to bend? What happens when two hearts choose each other, but an entire family stands in the way? Jenny Slatton and her husband, Sumit Singh, had long been entangled in family disputes. Sumit's parents never fully accepted Jenny. They always wanted him to marry a younger Indian woman, start a family, have children, and continue the lineage. After repeatedly hearing such words, Jenny became mentally exhausted. She wanted an independent life, while Sumit wanted to preserve family traditions. Jenny said, "I don't want to live under anyone's control." Sumit replied, "This is our culture. We must take care of our parents." Because of these conflicts, they eventually decided to separate. After 4 years, their relationship ended. On October 18th, their divorce was finalized in court. Later, Sumit married an Indian woman, respecting his parents' wishes. But the story didn't end there. Sumit filed a lawsuit against Jenny, claiming she had borrowed $50,000 and never returned it. The court investigated and ruled in Sumit's favor, and Jenny was fined $60,000. This is more than a story about marriage. It's about identity, sacrifice, and the heavy cost of choosing love over tradition. It's a love story that shocked millions of 90 Day Fiancé fans worldwide. Before the courtrooms, lawsuits, and broken dreams, Jenny and Sumit were two people who believed love could conquer everything. Their story began quietly, not with grand promises, but with simple conversations that turned into emotional dependence. Jenny, an American woman seeking companionship later in life, found comfort in Sumit's warmth, humor, and reassurance. Sumit felt seen and admired in ways he never had before. What began as friendship slowly grew into something deeper. When Jenny first traveled to India, she believed she was stepping into the next chapter of her life. To her, love meant freedom, living life on her own terms, away from judgment and control. But Sumit's reality was different. Raised in a deeply traditional Indian household, he believed family came before everything. His parents expected him to marry a younger Indian woman, have children, and continue the family lineage. In their eyes, it was duty, not a choice. At first, Sumit tried to balance both worlds. He reassured Jenny that love would prevail while hoping his parents would eventually accept her. But acceptance never came. Instead, tension grew. Sumit's parents never fully embraced Jenny, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented, change. The rejection was subtle at first, a cold glance, awkward silences, reminders that she didn't belong. Slowly, these moments piled up, turning her dream life into an emotional struggle. She had crossed borders for love, but she hadn't expected to fight an entire culture to keep it. As Jenny settled into life in India, she realized the biggest obstacle wasn't language, age, or distance. It was culture. She believed love required compromise, so she tried to adapt. She learned local customs, respected traditions, and made efforts to fit into a life that wasn't designed for her. But no matter how hard she tried, there was an invisible wall she could feel every day, but never break. Sumit's parents were polite on the surface, but distant at heart. They saw Jenny not as a wife, but as a disruption. Her age, nationality, independence, and refusal to fully submit symbolized everything against their beliefs. They wanted grandchildren, family rituals, and a daughter-in-law who would fit seamlessly into their household. Jenny felt constantly watched. Every decision she made, what she wore, how she spoke, when she went out, carried silent judgment. She was no longer just a wife, but someone under scrutiny. Sumit stood in the middle. Caught between love and loyalty, he believed patience would heal everything. But patience turned into pressure, and pressure became emotional exhaustion. Arguments started quietly, small disagreements about daily life escalating into conflicts about values. Jenny wanted personal space and independence. Sumit wanted harmony with his family. To him, caring for parents wasn't a choice. It was duty passed down through generations. One evening, during a heated conversation, Jenny finally spoke words she'd held inside for months. "I don't want to live under anyone's control." For her, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Sumit responded, "This is our culture. We must take care of our parents." In that moment, Jenny understood a painful truth. Love alone would never be enough. No matter how much they cared for each other, they were on opposite sides of beliefs neither could abandon. What Jenny saw as control, Sumit saw as duty. What Jenny saw as freedom, Sumit saw as betrayal. By the time Jenny realized Sumit's family would never accept her, the emotional damage was already done. Acceptance was never openly denied. It was withheld quietly and painfully. Sumit's parents never insulted her directly. Instead, they used silence. Family gatherings felt cold. Conversations stopped when she entered. Decisions were made without her input. She was present yet invisible. They believed Sumit had ruined his future, sacrificing tradition and family pride for a relationship they never approved of. Their words, though often unspoken, were clear, and Jenny felt the resentment. Each day, the pressure intensified. Sumit's parents reminded him of their expectations, lineage, societal judgment, and neighbors' whispers. Jenny didn't belong. For her, this rejection was deeply personal. She had left her country, comfort, and independence to build a life with Sumit, only to feel like a burden. Every day chipped away at her confidence. She questioned herself. Was she selfish for wanting love? Wrong for wanting independence? Was she destroying Sumit's life by staying? Sumit tried to shield her, but was slowly breaking too. Caught between his parents' emotional manipulation and Jenny's growing distress, he felt powerless. He loved Jenny, but feared losing his family forever. In his culture, abandoning parents wasn't just frowned upon, it was unforgivable. Arguments became more frequent. They weren't explosive, but they were heavy, exhausting, and emotionally draining. Jenny cried often. Sumit withdrew. Silence filled their home like a thick fog, suffocating everything it touched. What hurt Jenny the most wasn't just rejection, it was realization. She understood that no matter how long she stayed, no matter how much she sacrificed, Sumit's parents would never see her as family. And Sumit, though he loved her, would never fully stand against them. This wasn't a temporary problem. It was a permanent reality. Slowly, painfully, Jenny began to crack under the weight of a life she no longer recognized as her own. By the time the emotional pressure reached its peak, Jenny was no longer fighting anyone else. She was fighting herself. The woman who had arrived in India full of hope and belief in love had slowly faded into someone unrecognizable. The rejection, tension, and constant feeling of being unwanted invaded her mind day and night. Jenny stopped sleeping properly. Her thoughts raced endlessly, replaying the same painful questions. Why was she never enough? Why did love feel like punishment? Why did every attempt to build peace end in more silence? She began withdrawing from daily life. Simple routines felt exhausting. Cooking seemed meaningless. Conversations felt forced. Even moments alone with Sumit no longer brought comfort because the shadow of his family was always present, even when they weren't physically there. What hurt the most was loneliness. Jenny had given up everything, her country, her independence, her familiar life, only to feel more isolated than ever. She had no real support system, no one to confide in, no place where she felt truly safe. She tried to be strong, telling herself that endurance was love and patience was sacrifice, hoping that one day it would all make sense. But her mental health was slowly unraveling under expectations she never agreed to carry. Sumit noticed the change. He saw her tears. He heard the tremble in her voice. But instead of confronting the problem, he avoided it. Deep down, he was afraid of choosing sides, afraid of losing his parents, afraid of admitting the situation was beyond repair. This avoidance only made things worse. Jenny felt unseen, unheard, and unsupported. There were moments when she sat alone, staring at walls, questioning whether love was ever meant to feel this painful. She began doubting her worth, her decisions, even her sanity. One night, after a particularly tense conversation about family responsibilities, Jenny broke down completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, but silently. She cried until there were no tears left. She realized she was living a life where every day felt like a battle she was losing. Love was no longer giving her strength. It was draining her. That night marked a turning point. Jenny didn't decide immediately, but something inside her shifted. For the first time, she allowed herself to think the unthinkable. What if walking away was the only way to survive? After that silent breakdown, life inside their home changed, not dramatically, but painfully. Every day became a quiet war between love and tradition. On the surface, nothing seemed different. They woke up, ate meals, and went about their routines. But underneath, tension simmered constantly. Conversations that once felt warm now felt cautious. Every topic carried the risk of turning into an argument. Jenny wanted boundaries. She wanted a life where decisions were made together, not dictated by parents, customs, or societal expectations. She wanted privacy, independence, and the freedom to live without constantly feeling judged. Sumit wanted balance, but balance was becoming impossible. To him, family wasn't something you negotiated with. It was something you honored, even if it caused personal unhappiness. Caring for parents, listening to them, and placing their needs above his own was not oppression, it was respect. This difference poisoned even the smallest moments. A simple plan to travel turned into a debate about parental approval. A quiet evening together was interrupted by phone calls reminding Sumit of his responsibilities. Jenny felt like a guest in her own marriage, while Sumit felt trapped between two worlds that refused to coexist. Arguments became routine, not screaming matches, but emotionally heavy discussions that ended without resolution. Jenny expressed her pain. Sumit acknowledged it, then returned to the same patterns. Apologies were offered, but nothing changed. That hurt more than anger ever could. Jenny began to feel that love in this marriage always came second. Second to culture, second to family, second to expectations she never signed up for. After another discussion about living arrangements and parental involvement, Jenny said something that shook Sumit deeply. I gave up my whole life for you, but I feel like I don't even exist here. Sumit had no answer. He loved her, but he could not imagine a future where his parents were not central to his life. Choosing Jenny over them filled him with guilt and fear. In his mind, such a choice would destroy his identity. And so the war continued. Every compromise felt one-sided. Every sacrifice felt heavier. Love was no longer a refuge. It had become a battlefield. Jenny slowly understood a heartbreaking truth. This wasn't about winning or losing. They were fighting for two completely different futures. And no matter how much they loved each other, only one future could survive. By the time Jenny reached her final breaking point, she was no longer angry. She was exhausted. Exhausted from explaining herself, exhausted from waiting for change, exhausted from hoping love would outweigh tradition. Every day felt like emotional labor, constantly adjusting, constantly compromising, constantly shrinking herself to fit into a life that never truly welcomed her. She realized something painful but undeniable. She was surviving, not living. The constant presence of Sumit's family expectations had slowly erased her sense of self. Her independence, once her greatest strength, now felt like a threat in a household built on obedience and hierarchy. She felt controlled, not always through words, but through expectations she could never escape. One evening, after another discussion about Sumit caring for his parents, Jenny finally spoke. Her voice was calm, her hands steady. I don't want to live under anyone's control, she said. Those words weren't an ultimatum. They were a confession. Jenny explained that love should feel like partnership, not submission. Marriage should feel like safety, not surveillance. Respecting culture should not require sacrificing mental health. For the first time, she spoke honestly without fear of consequences. Sumit listened, then replied with a sentence that shattered any remaining hope. This is our culture. We must take care of our parents. To him, it wasn't cruel, it was truth. To Jenny, it felt like a door closing. In that moment, she understood that Sumit wasn't choosing his parents over her. He had never seen it as a choice. Their values were fundamentally incompatible. What Jenny called control, Sumit called responsibility. What Jenny called freedom, Sumit called abandonment. There was no middle ground left. Silence followed, not the heavy, painful silence of past arguments, but a quiet acceptance that something irreversible had happened. They both knew it, even if neither said it aloud. That night, Jenny sat alone, reflecting on the years she had invested, the sacrifices she had made, and the person she had become. For the first time in a long time, she asked herself a question that wasn't about love. What do I need to survive? The answer terrified her, but it also gave her clarity. Sometimes choosing yourself is the most painful decision of all, especially when love is still present in the weeks that followed. Jenny began to prepare herself for the reality she had been avoiding. She realized that love alone couldn't sustain a marriage where values and priorities were so fundamentally different. Every day spent trying to fit into a world that never truly accepted her chipped away at her confidence and her spirit. Jenny knew she had to reclaim her life, even if it meant stepping away from someone she still loved deeply. Sumit, meanwhile, remained caught between worlds. He loved Jenny, but he had never imagined living a life without his parents' approval. Their expectations were ingrained in him from childhood, a code he felt unable to break. Every time he thought about choosing Jenny, guilt and fear washed over him. He didn't want to hurt her, but he also didn't want to betray the family and culture that shaped his identity. Despite their continued arguments and heavy silences, the two shared moments that reminded them of what had brought them together in the first place. They laughed at old jokes, remembered trips, and quietly celebrated small victories. Yet, those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the growing tension that neither could ignore. Jenny realized that even the love she felt was now tied to pain. It no longer felt free. It was entangled with fear, compromise, and constant negotiation. One evening, after another long day of unspoken frustration, Jenny sat alone in their home, thinking about what her future could look like. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could make decisions for herself without fear of judgment or rejection. She pictured waking up without anxiety, eating meals without stress, and enjoying her own independence again. The clarity was both liberating and heartbreaking. She loved Sumit, but loving him no longer meant living in a way that destroyed her. Jenny finally made the decision to speak her truth openly. She told Sumit that she could not continue living in a marriage where she felt invisible and powerless. She explained that her departure was not a failure of love, but a necessary act of self-preservation. She emphasized that love should bring safety, support, and partnership, not constant doubt and control. Sumit listened silently. He wanted to argue, to convince her to stay. But he also knew deep down that the tension between his family's expectations and Jenny's need for independence had become insurmountable. Their conversations continued for days, sometimes tense, sometimes tearful, but always honest. Jenny was unwavering. She knew that leaving was the only way she could survive emotionally and mentally. Sumit, torn between his love for her and his sense of duty to his family, finally accepted that their paths could no longer align. They both mourned the loss of what could have been, a future where love alone might have sufficed if not for the pressure of family and culture. Eventually, the decision to separate became official. The process was painful but inevitable. They filed for divorce, and after months of legal and emotional negotiation, their marriage was officially dissolved. For Jenny, the end of her marriage marked both sorrow and relief. She grieved the dream she had invested in and the life she had imagined with Sumit, but she also felt the first flicker of freedom she had experienced in years. After the divorce, life did not become immediately easy. Jenny faced challenges she hadn't anticipated, including financial strain and the emotional aftermath of leaving a life she had devoted herself to. Sumit, on the other hand, remarried an Indian woman, following the path his parents had always envisioned. Though he tried to move forward, the memory of Jenny and what they had shared lingered, a quiet reminder of what sacrifice and cultural duty had cost him. The story did not end there. Sumit later filed a lawsuit against Jenny, claiming she had borrowed $50,000 and never returned it. The court investigated and ruled in Sumit's favor. Jenny was ordered to pay $60,000. This added another layer of complexity and pain, but Jenny approached it with resolve. She understood that life was no longer about defending herself in someone else's framework. It was about rebuilding her own. Through the aftermath, Jenny learned difficult but vital lessons about love, identity, and self-respect. She realized that love could be profound and transformative, but it could also be limiting and destructive when bound by obligations she could never agree to carry. The experience shaped her understanding of what it truly meant to love oneself, even in the shadow of heartbreak. Jenny's journey was not just about leaving a marriage. It was about reclaiming autonomy in a world where cultural expectations often overshadow individual desires. She began to rebuild her life slowly, reconnecting with her roots, establishing a support network, and rediscovering passions and goals she had put aside for years. Each step was a small victory,